So I'm just going to follow on from what Mike and Rose have talked about. I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to the pilot site of Mellor. And I'm going to try and explain why we're involved in this project and also some of the risks, the meteorological risks that we face, which will be augmented by climate change potentially. And hopefully that'll answer some of your questions. So first, maybe put your hands up if after Mike's talk you thought, how the hell has Mellor got on a project with the Baths of Diocletian, Ephesus and Rethymno? And I don't know the answer to that. I do really have the answer. So Mike mentioned it briefly, but Mellor's got a really wide range of archaeological remains. And significantly, we're the only pilot site on the project that has industrial period archaeology. And for North West England in particular, or for England in general, that's really important for us. But from my point of view as an environmental scientist, is the three sites at Mellor. So Mellor is a complex, really, with three individual sites. Mellor Mill is in a steep-sided valley, and it's about 100 metres above sea level. The old vicarage, which is where we are now, is about 200 metres above sea level. And Shaw Cairn, on top of Mellor Moor, is about 300 metres above sea level. And each one of these sites has very different, what we term as microclimates. So the environmental threats to each site is very different. This is Mellor Mill when it was standing. It was built in the 1790s, as Mike said, and I won't go into too much detail because Bob's going to give you a tour of the mill later today. But think about how big that is, and the 6 stories high, and when you get to the site you'll think, how on earth did it fit in where it is? It was built in 1790 and it was burnt down in 1892. And it was, at the time of its building, it was the largest cotton mill of its time, and it set the standard for many of the mills across northwest England. It was built by Samuel Oldknow, and he had to divert the River Goyt to fill the mill ponds which would power the mill. And in later years, steam power was also used to supplement the power. In the early 20th century, the mill would have still been standing, well, the remnants would have still been standing, and eventually they were pulled down and it was just left to ruin. And it wasn't until 2009 when Mellor Archaeological Trust, and it's Salford Archaeology now, but it was Greater Manchester Archaeological Unit, started to excavate the site. Really recently, so finishing in October this year, was a National Lottery Heritage Fund project which finished, and we've landscaped the whole site and conservation works have been carried out on the site. And it is really, if you've not been down, you'll go down today on the tour, but I think you'll want to come back because it's really impressive what they've done. The old vicarage site, this is a picture from 1995, and it's quite topical because this year, as Mike said, we had the heat wave between, I'd say, April and July, where it felt like it didn't rain. And as a result, we had parch marks all over the country that were being recorded, and it even got onto the news. And that is exactly how this site up here was found. So in 1995, Anne, who lives up at the vicarage, looked out over a lawn and saw parch marks, and in between those parch marks was a lush green arcing bit of land that she assumed, she knew it was archaeological, but she thought it was much newer than it is. And it wasn't until Manchester Archaeological Unit went out and they said to her, actually this is really old. And it turned out that it was one of 2 Iron Age ditches which surrounded a hilltop settlement. If I get the pointer on. So, part of the Storm project, we've been able to use multispectral cameras on drones. And this is a multispectral shot of the same field from this year. And you can just about make out the green arcing line here. Can you see that? Yeah? And that shows the Iron Age ditch in the field here where Anne saw it, but it also helps us track it further into the next field here and where it goes under her property here. Today, part of the Iron Age ditch remains exposed for people to view, and also there is a reconstructed roundhouse within the site, which was built in the 2000s as part of another European project, and I'll come to why that's significant in a minute. Shaw Cairn is up on Mellor Moor, and it's a Bronze Age burial site. It was first excavated in the 70s and the 80s, and it wasn't until the 2000s that Mellor Archaeological Trust and Salford Archaeology took it on and started to excavate more. The things they found up there are bone remains and a necklace of amber beads, which suggests that the people that were buried up there were fairly important. So for Storm then, what we've had to do is we've had to take what we call use cases from those three sites. So in our case, we've took the Iron Age ditch at the old vicarage here, the exposed part of the ditch. We've took the reconstructed roundhouse. We've took Mellor Mill and some areas of the mill, which I'll talk about later. And Shaw Cairn, so all of the ground-based archaeology up at Shaw Cairn. And as Rose said, we had to link the use cases to what threats we thought, me and Bob, as site managers, were the biggest threats to the archaeology. So at the old vicarage, we thought, and this might be augmented by climate change or it might not be, Rose's analysis would tell us that, we thought that severe electrical storms and high winds would be the biggest threat. So we were worried about high winds bringing down trees and branches which would fall on the archaeology and damage it directly. For the roundhouse, we're interested in increased human activity, but in terms of a meteorological point of view or a climate point of view, we're interested in how the roundhouse survives and how it degrades over time, because it was built, as best we know, to how it would have been built originally. The mill site's got many more threats. It's probably our best site, so to speak. It's got the threat of rainfall on the site, so if there's more heavy rain events, then that's going to erode the site quicker. If there's less rain, then it might be better, as someone said before. Prolonged period of low temperatures, which kind of links to rain, and we're thinking about freeze-thaw action on the site. And damage to the northern mill pond dam. So the mill ponds are still there today, and they're being dammed up, and one of the biggest threats that we're worried about is if that dam is breached somehow, and the whole site would be flooded. So these are the use cases. So this is the roundhouse that you'll see. Kirsty's not here yet. Kirsty's going to give you a really good tour of the site, so I won't go into too much detail. And this is the exposed Iron Age ditch. At the mill, what we're interested in recording and monitoring is the steam engine beds here, where there was a tree with the roots were growing into the archaeology, but that's now been removed. And we're also interested in the Wellington wheel pit. And the reason we're interested in that is because of how wet it gets. And at cold temperatures, we're really worried about the freeze thaw within the wheel pit. And as I said, Shaw Cairn, we're worried about the whole ground-based archaeological remains that are exposed and remain exposed. And unlike many of the other sites, our site is open to the public, so anyone can go in. There's no restrictions on people walking over it or doing anything. There's no monitoring, there's no security or anything like that. So the threats are even more. So that's what we're looking at to monitor, but how are we monitoring it? Well, Storms enabled Mellor Archaeological Trust to purchase some sensors, and the ones I'm going to tell you about are weather environment type sensors. So we've got 3 weather stations, 1 at each of the the Mellor sites. And the reason for that is because of that microclimate. So the climate down at the mill, or the weather down at the mill, can be very different to the mill on top of Shaw Cairn. The weather stations we've chosen are Davis Vantage Pro 2 weather stations, and what we say that they are is they are the top end of amateur weather stations. So if you're a really keen weather enthusiast, you would probably have one of these in your garden. But for our needs, they're good enough quality without spending too much money. And that's a key thing about Storm, is we can't spend money because sites in general don't have the money to spend, so they can't buy a £5,000 weather station. On top of that, we got some environmental sensors, which we've placed 15 of them around this site. And I think there's actually one just outside that window. And they give us a really good view of the temperature across the site. Significantly, and I'll show you on the demonstration that I do at the end, we've got them within the archaeology. So we can see the change in temperatures, say, at the top of the ditch and at the bottom of the ditch. And then coming on, so that's how we monitor the environment, but then we also have to monitor the assets. So to do that, we're using laser scanners and photogrammetry techniques, usually using drones. And what we're going to do is we're going to scan it once a month, and then those scans will be compared to one another, and we'll see where damage occurs on the asset. So if a crack opens up, the damage would show up on the 3D model. We'll also scan the asset directly after a major weather event. So Hurricane Ophelia, or ex-Hurricane Ophelia last year, we rushed out to scan the site then. Luckily there wasn't much damage, but that's what we're going to be doing into the future. We've now got loads of data. So we've been collecting data since December 6, 2016, and we've started doing the monthly laser scans, so we can now actually analyse the asset. We can actually see where damage is occurring. Most of our assets are being affected by slow onset disasters, so it is a waiting game really. This is some of the data. I'll show you what it looks like in the dashboard at the end. This is an example of a 3D scan of the roundhouse, and it gives us a really good, if not millimetre then centimetre accurate 3D model of the asset. And I haven't got an example to show you, but we can actually overlay these time series of models to show the damage. And then the laser scanners have, that's not a great example, but they have an onboard camera. So not only do we get the 3D point cloud, we also get a 3D true colour representation of the asset as well. And drone photogrammetry is used. Because of how cheap drones have become, we can now deploy drones readily and easily, and it's much cheaper than using the laser scanner. And the cameras are so good on these drones now that this is an example of a 3D model created by a drone. And this is the tree I was talking about, where the roots were growing into the archaeology. As part of the consolidation works at the mill that recently took place, this was removed. So it's no longer there, unfortunately. And I mentioned this briefly. So we have a multispectral camera which takes photographs in the near infrared. And what that allows us to do, specifically at Shore Cairn, which is this example, is it allows us to track the vegetation growth over the archaeology through the year. So when we get the time series of data for that, you'll see the growth and the dieback of the vegetation on top of the archaeology. It's using a technique called NDVI, which is the difference between near infrared and red light being reflected by the plants. I know Mike showed this before. The point I put this in here is that one problem with Storm, from our point of view, is that we set this. They asked us as site managers what hazards we were worried about, and that's not necessarily the hazards that we're going to face. So at no point when I was talking to Rose at the start of the project, and I said I was worried about freeze thaw, did she say, what about wildfires? Because we all assumed that wouldn't be an issue. So it kind of answers someone's question from before, is that there are hazards that we haven't taken into account because maybe the site manager didn't know about them or it just wasn't expected. And again, it comes back to freeze thaw. So we thought, me and Bob together, that at the mill, freeze thaw would get worse because we thought climate change would lead to extremes at both ends of the spectrum. But Rose's analysis has showed that it won't, and 3 store days will be reduced. Okay, I won't show you that. Do we give up?
It was all right when you showed the YouTube this morning, wasn't it?
It's gone. Where's okay then, all the sensors that we're using and the laser scans and everything comes together in this platform which the site manager can access, and it tells. One thing I should have said about the weather stations and the environmental sensors is that they're all online sensors. So the data is taken at the weather station every 15 minutes and that's uploaded to the storm dashboard instantly, and me and Bob can then look to see how the site's doing. At the minute, all we can see is the data, but in the future, it should link to the climate or the historic climate analysis and thresholds, and it should alert us when temperatures cross below that threshold or above a threshold, and tell us what to do. So significantly on the dashboard, there's forms that we can fill out about the assets, about the materials, and about conservation works, so that when those thresholds are triggered, it will tell me or Bob what we have to do at the site, and we can act on it and try and prevent weather events from damaging the assets. That's all.
In the event that I have a rush of blood to the head, how much would a Davis weather station cost me to put in my back garden?
Approximately.
So well, if you just want the weather station, it would cost probably £500, £600.
Oh, I see.
But what we've got is, we've got a logger on that weather station that's got a SIM card that will send the data, and that costs £1,000 itself.
Oh.
So you wouldn't have that, but you wouldn't need that.
Another 500 quid deal, yeah.
We need the 3G connectivity because it's so remote. There's no internet access down at the mill, or up here, or at Shoreham.
Well, I'm not quite.
Well, I'm sure you have internet.
No,
So,
just
yeah.
wondering what my back garden could take. Yeah.
If you want one, I'll set you up.
Thank you very much.
When you say you get all this information in and you'll be able to do things, what will the kind of... I can imagine you're dashing down to the site, and I want to know what the sort of things that you'll be able to do. Because, you know, when the weather's like that, we haven't got a lot of control over it.
No. So, if it's a sudden hazard, like it was about to flood, chances are me and Bob would just say, we'll leave it. You know, we're not... Essentially, we've got to make sure that everyone's safe that's on the site rather than protect the archaeology. But a lot of our hazards are slow onset, and there's in the project there are conservators that can help us come up with policies and plans that we can implement long term.
When we had those floods a few years back, and I worked on a project at Radcliffe, and they just spent an awful lot of money on the church, and it just got completely flooded, and it was just such a shame. And I'm just trying to think of that, if that kind of thing happened here, what could be done about it before it happened.
Well, risk assessment, you mean?
Yeah, you know, it just ruined the church completely.
Yeah. So for example, part of when this dashboard is all up and running, part of the conservation work would be, maybe one of the policies would be to ensure that there was ways of opening up at the mill, opening up old gates to allow the water to flow back into the river.
Right.
But those policies would come from the experts rather than from us.
Right.
And we would just implement what we're told to implement.
Yeah.
We talked about this a long time ago. So we look back through when the mill has flooded in the past, and we saw that, we tried to analyse what the weather leading up to that was doing, and then try to say that would be a threshold. So if for 5 days we've got straight rain, really heavy rain, it might say there's a chance it could flood this week, and then we could start to implement things.
Maybe I can add something to that, because I remember when we were working on the risk management strategies for heat waves, for example, one of the things that we defined for Mellor was to put up like a breathable membrane to cover like vulnerable parts of the structure. So there are definitely things that can be done. This is not an example for flooding, but it's for a heat wave, which you can of course measure. And
You've got to have this kind of thing built into it when you give the grants out.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be able to give the grants out unless this is what they've got to do.
Well, I know with the previous round of funding they had at the mill, they did produce a report which had specific things that needed to be done. And whether those were done or not, I'm not sure, but there were, I don't know, for example, improved drainage has to be done before you start doing the work. Because like you say, there's no point in conserving the archaeology if it's just going to get wrecked again
It's a waste
in 2
of money,
years.
isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
But we're not wasting money, don't worry.
Oh no, I'm just saying if you do the heritage lottery thing and you don't build all this into it,
Yeah.
like they did at Radcliffe, nobody foresaw what was going to happen, and they had all this money and they had to do it all again. I think they got insurance for the flood, but it just seemed such an utter shame to me that these people had done all this work and then that happened.
If we do a lot of prevention work, it will not end up in a tragedy like a sudden, like that.
Okay.
The original mill, it was designed to have water running through it, and it's got all the tunnels to take water away already, hasn't it, if these were cleared?
Yeah. So that comes back to the point that maybe one of the policies would be to open up those tunnels again, because a lot of them will be, I assume a lot are still blocked up now, which would allow the water to flow back into the river naturally.
Can I ask about the potential for crowd sensing? At the start of the project there was discussion about using crowd sensing techniques, in other words using people's mobile phones, take photographs and such things, as a way of involving people in the project. Has there been any progress with that? Is there further potential to use that technique?
So Jim from Sparta Digital in Manchester, we have developed an app which is still it's not quite ready, but it will be ready within weeks, that'll work at the Mellor pilot site and the Troyer pilot site. And it's almost like a game that takes people around. So in Mellor, it takes you around the new mill site to collect coins. And you collect the coin, and what we're using it for in Mellor is it tells us where people are using the phone. So we know where people are walking, where they're going, which ways they're going round, what they're standing on or not standing on. In Troyer, it's more question and answer based. So the game takes you to one of their sites and it will ask you questions about what you see. Simple things like how many bricks are in this wall or something, and you put the answer in or you take a picture. And that's fed back to them to analyse the data. So we are working on it.
Just adding to that, if it's like a game that takes you round, instead of monitoring where people are going, isn't it going to be steering and directing them to specific locations, and then it's going to threaten those specific areas?
Yeah.
So
that's exactly the point. So we can alter that game. So if we want to take people away from an area, we can change where the tokens are and drive them away. But there's not that much influence because they're looking for tokens. So they get to the mill and they've got to walk around the site to find where those tokens are. We're not telling them where they are. It's almost like Pokemon Go, where you have to go and find what you're looking for. There's not too much. There is a bit of guiding because we put some information in about certain aspects of the site. But you can do it in any order you want. It's not a guided tour.
You know, when you're going through your case studies about like Mellor Mill and Shaw Cairn and stuff, the roundhouse was also a case study. Even though it's a reconstruction, is it being treated in the same way as the archaeology?
No, not in the same way. We're just interested in how it degrades, because it's the best thing we've got to look at how it would have degraded for them, type thing. But it's obviously not as important as the ditch or as the mill.